On the 28th of February 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated series of strikes on Iran, killing the supreme leader and detonating a geopolitical powder keg that has been building for years. Within 48 hours, vessel traffic through the Strait of Hormuz collapsed by 70%. The world's single most important energy artery is now, for all intents and purposes, closed. And while politicians have spent the last year taking victory laps over falling inflation, a statistical mirage has been shattered by a $500 billion daily supply chain that no one in Washington has any plan of replacing. And today we crack open the raw data behind the Strait of Hormuz closure, expose exactly how this energy shock will reignite inflation, and reveal why the Federal Reserve is now officially flying blind. My name is Nick, and you're watching Coin Bureau Finance. To understand the sheer magnitude of what just happened, we first have to understand why a narrow strip of water in the Persian Gulf has the power to send the entire global economy into a cardiac arrest. Think of the Strait of Hormuz as a main artery of the global industrial engine. Every single day, approximately 20 million barrels of oil flow through that corridor, and that is 20% of all the petroleum liquids consumed on this entire planet. It is more than 1/4 of all seaborne oil trade moving through a shipping lane that is just 33 kilometers wide. Now, I know what you're thinking. The US is energy independent now. Record domestic production at 13.6 million barrels per day. Why should anyone in Kansas or Ohio care about a choke point halfway around the world? And this is precisely the narrative the mainstream media is selling, and it is a complete misreading of how global commodity markets actually work. Oil is a globally priced commodity. When you fill up at a gas station in Ohio, you are not paying for Ohio crude. You are paying the spot price for a global commodity. And when 20 million barrels per day get choked out of the global financial system, that spot price spikes everywhere, instantly, regardless of where your local refinery sources its crude. There is no domestic production shield and no American exception. As Clayton Siegel at the Center for Strategic and International Relations put it directly, quote, "Since oil is a global, fungible commodity, a disruption anywhere affects prices everywhere." And the disruption we are looking at right now dwarfs anything we've seen in living memory. The 1973 Arab oil embargo removed approximately 4.4 million barrels per day from global markets. It sent prices quadrupling, triggered the worst recession since the Great Depression, and permanently rewired how the world thinks about energy security. The Hormuz closure threatens 20 million barrels per day. And to put that into perspective, the current crisis is operating at a scale nearly 5 times larger than the most traumatic energy shock in modern history. And that is why Saul Kavonic at MST Marquee is calling this potentially 3 times the severity of the 1970s oil embargo combined with the Iranian Revolution, or why Bog McNally at Repedian Energy Group said plainly, quote, "A prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz is guaranteed global recession." Now, before we connect these dots to the Federal Reserve's impossible position, we need to talk about your financial safety. Because geopolitical shocks like this one have a history of destroying portfolios built on outdated assumptions, and the window to position correctly is always narrower than people think. And that is exactly why you should subscribe to the free Coin Bureau Finance weekly newsletter. Every week, we break down the macro data the mainstream media ignores and give you actionable insights on what global events like this one actually mean for your portfolio. And you can sign up right now by hitting the link in the description or by scanning this QR code on your screen. It costs you nothing, but in a market running on outdated assumptions, it could save you everything. Okay, back to the video. And here is what most analysts are missing about the current crisis. The Strait of Hormuz is not being physically blockaded by Iranian warships staging a dramatic naval confrontation. The closure is being enforced by insurance underwriters in London. Following the US and Israeli strikes on the 28th of February, war risk insurers issued 48 to 72-hour cancellation notices for vessels transiting the Gulf. Marsh, the world's largest insurance broker, estimates near-term rate increases of 25 to 50% for any ship attempting to move through the strait. Before this crisis, the war risk premium for Hormuz transit was approximately 0.25% of a vessel's insured hull value. On a $150 million container ship, that was roughly $375,000 for a single transit. Post-crisis, these premiums have already doubled to 0.5% or more, meaning $750,000 per transit. Costs that get passed directly to the cargo owners as a war risk surcharge. CMA CGN has already introduced an emergency conflict surcharge of $2,000 per 20-foot container. Hapag-Lloyd, MSC, and Maersk have all suspended transits entirely. And this reveals the deeper mechanisms at work. It's not a naval blockade, but an insurance withdrawal, and the effect on cargo flows is identical. And right now, approximately 150 tankers are sitting at anchor in Gulf waters. 14 liquefied natural gas or LNG carriers have slowed or stopped near the strait. Around 170 container ships carrying 450,000 shipping containers are trapped inside the Persian Gulf with no exit. The waterway is not formally closed, but for every commercial operator that matters, it might as well be. Now, for the nations whose economies are directly wired to Gulf energy, this is not a distant abstraction. Saudi Arabia moves 5.5 million barrels per day through the strait, and that's 38% of total Hormuz crude flows. Iraq has no alternative but that route whatsoever. Neither does Kuwait, and neither does Qatar. Saudi Arabia and the UAE do have bypass pipelines with a combined capacity of roughly 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. Against 20 million barrels of daily Hormuz transit, that covers at best 27% of the daily flow. The other 14 million barrels per day are physically trapped. Yes, 14 million barrels per day have no bypass, no pipeline, no reroute, nowhere to go. And on the natural gas side, things are arguably worse. Qatar alone exports approximately 9.3 billion cubic feet per day of LNG through the strait, and Qatar Energy has now halted production entirely. European natural gas futures jumped more than 40% on Monday morning as a result. Because Europe, which replaced Russian pipeline gas with Qatari LNG after 2022, is now staring at a second energy supply crisis in 4 years. Now let's talk about what this actually does for your cost of living, because the transmission mechanism from an oil shock to grocery prices is faster and more brutal than most people might realize. As of January 2026, core producer prices in the United States were already running hot. A core PPI came in at 3.6% year over year, the highest reading in 10 months and more than double what many analysts were expecting on a monthly basis. And this data arrived before a single barrel of oil was disrupted by the current crisis. Producers were already facing mounting cost pressures from tariffs and supply chain friction. And now, on top of that foundation, we are about to pour a 10% oil price shock onto an already strained system. And here's how the plumbing works. Energy costs are woven into the price of everything that moves, everything that gets produced, and everything that gets packaged. A diesel is 37% of total US trucking operating costs. The moment that diesel spikes, freight surcharges get repriced weekly against the Department of Energy's benchmarks. Higher freight costs hit the retailers. The retailer, facing what amounts to a structural deficit in their margins, eventually passes these costs onto the consumer. Every $10 increase in the price of oil translates to a roughly 0.2% added to headline consumer prices. Brent crude jumped by more than $6 in 48 hours, and analysts at Barclays, UBS, and Wood Mackenzie are now all forecasting a path toward $100 per barrel or higher if disruptions persist. And that is a potential $30 price increase from recent baselines. Now, you don't need a calculator to see that this will show up at the checkout line. And the American consumer is entirely underprepared to absorb it. As we covered in our last deep dive on the stretched consumer, Americans now owe $1.28 trillion on their credit cards, a record that has never been breached since the New York Fed began tracking it in 1999. And the average interest rate on that debt is above 22%. More than half of all credit card holders are now using their cards to cover essential expenses like food, fuel, and medical bills. Since January 2020, food prices at grocery stores have risen 30% cumulatively. And beef is up 15% year over year just in January's data. And coffee prices are surging at nearly 4.5% annually. These are the stress fractures that existed before the oil shock actually arrived. In other words, the average US consumer is already running on empty. And now we're about to see a structural energy cost increase on top of everything they are already absorbing. And this creates what economists are calling a stagflationary environment, slowing economic growth paired with rising prices. And it's not theoretical. RBC Economics, RSM, and Apollo Global Management were all already using the phrase, quote, stagflation light to describe the US economy before the first missile was even launched. Q4 2025 GDP growth was a tepid 1.4% annualized. The core PCE was already running at 3%, well above the Fed's 2% target. The oil shock does not create a new problem. It catastrophically accelerates one that was already unfolding. Which brings us to the grim reality of where this all ends up. Because the Federal Reserve is now caught in one of the most vicious policy traps in its history. And to understand how dangerous that trap actually is, we need to rewind to 1973. When the Arab oil embargo hit, the Federal Reserve was led by Chairman Arthur Burns. And Burns looked at soaring energy prices and concluded this was a temporary supply-driven shock outside the control of monetary policy. So the Fed kept monetary policy conditions very loose. And they doubled down on expansion even as inflation was already accelerating. By 1973, annual inflation had hit 12%. By 1979, after the second oil shock from the Iranian Revolution, inflation peaked at 15%. Burns was actually running the same playbook that the Fed would later run during COVID, calling a supply-driven price shock transitory and refusing to tighten because the underlying economy looked fragile. And the result was a lost decade for American purchasing power. It was only when Paul Volcker took over in 1979 and raised the federal funds rate to a staggering 20% that the inflation spiral was finally broken, at the cost of 2 back-to-back recessions and nearly 4 million jobs. Sound familiar? Now, look at the position the Federal Reserve finds itself in today. The Fed funds rate is sitting at 3.5 to 3.75%. The core PCE is at 3% and rising. Core PPI just printed 3.6%. And oil is now surging toward $100 a barrel on a supply shock the Fed has no way to address. If the Fed cuts rates to protect the economy from a slowdown, and there is real pressure to do exactly that, then they risk embedding this oil inflation into the broader price level and repeating exactly what Arthur Burns did in 1974. However, if they hold rates high or raise them in response to the oil shock, they will crush the commercial real estate market, tighten financial conditions into a slowing economy, and potentially trigger the very recession they were trying to avoid. The Fed cannot print oil, they cannot open the Straits of Hormuz, and they cannot simultaneously fight inflation and support growth when the source of this inflation is a geopolitical event with no monetary policy solution. They are, in the most literal sense, flying blind. And the market knows it. Traders are pricing a 94% probability of no rate cut at the 17th of March meeting. The probability of a June cut has already collapsed. The closure of the world's most critical energy artery is not a localized geopolitical squabble between two countries with a long history of posturing. It's a systemic shock to the architecture of the global economy. By choking off 20 million barrels of daily supply, this crisis guarantees a resurgence of inflation in an economy that never fully defeated it. It forces central banks into an impossible corner between fighting price increases and preventing a financial collapse. And it ensures that the cost of living for the average consumer, already drowning in record credit card debt, already absorbing 30% cumulative food price increases since 2020, is about to get significantly worse. The statistical mirage of defeated inflation is over. The data was already broken before the first missile ever left its launcher. And now the economic reality is about to catch up to what millions of people's wallets have been telling them all along. But I want to hear from you. Do you think this oil shock will force the Fed to actually raise interest rates again? Or will they ignore the inflation risks and cut rates anyway, just to save the stock market? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. This is Nick, signing off.